Welcome back to the class, everyone. I'm sure a lot of you have heard by now that Rey and her new Datacron are causing a lot of problems in Grand Arena. And while this video really doesn't have anything to do with Rey or her Datacron, we do need to talk about this monstrosity that is currently countering Rey to great effect, but at the same time, it's a little bit weird because it's a team that can use up to 7 Omicrons. And what that has done for me is it begs the question that we've actually already addressed a little bit before. Do the triple Omicron characters need to be triple Omicroned? Now, to do this analysis properly, we are of course going to be using a spreadsheet along with data taken from SWGOH.gg, filtering out the Omicrons and everything that they're doing, both offensively and defensively, and then showing where the results are, which ones of these characters are actually genuinely benefiting from having that second or third Omicron. Before we get into the actual data itself, let's go ahead and check out some of the rules that we used to govern what we were doing here. Number one Omicron is always present. That means that the data that we're using here specifically is going to assume that you have 1 Omicron on each and every single one of these characters. And the reason why is, I guess, if you're even remotely interested in wanting to apply Omicrons to do better in GAC, you're probably already going to do 1, and most of the time that is going to be the leadership, or if the character does not have a leadership, it is going to go on the very important unique. And we're not going to go into great detail why Starkiller's unique is the best Omicron for him, because most people have already agreed on that a long time ago, and that's true for pretty much every single one of these characters, which Omicron that we all already have applied. Now, we're not really going to be talking about that one specifically, but we're going to be comparing what those characters do with the 1 Omicron versus having the second and the third. All data also assumes at least Relic 3 on both sides. While we don't assume that most players are going to be using Datacrons, we want to be representing the teams that could, because I don't want to have to deal with what Gear 11 Banes are doing, or really what people are using, you know, R9 Bo-Katan to beat on offense if the enemy team has Gear 12s on it. Next up, we're only using 5v5 data. This is just purely used for convenience. It took me about an hour and a half to compile all the data that we see before us. I didn't want it to be 3, I apologize. The data set is from seasons 36 through 50. The reason why we cherry picked those seasons is because that's every single season that was currently available on .gg. So it can't have more. I guess I could have less, but I really didn't want to isolate the seasons that much, because what we end up getting is a heavy influence from specific Datacrons that are not permanent, that we shouldn't be basing decisions for applying an Omicron or really any resource out of. So with all that being said, let's get to the actual data. Let's talk about Starkiller first. Starkiller has been a pretty reliable Rey counter for the majority of his existence. There have been some recent problems due to both Datacrons as well as new characters for Rey, and he overall has about a 69% success rate when used on offense against everything as a whole. That is not specifically against Rey, although Rey does make up the majority of that, and overall, that is an okay winning rate to have. It typically implies that there is some nuance going on, which makes perfect sense when you think about the Rey counter. You have to know when to strip the inspired off, when to go for the kills, when to drop the ship, etc. Now, when we want to apply, or when we go to apply a second Omicron to Starkiller, we need to understand that right now, most of the value is packed behind Force Repulse. This is my opinion, but it is also going to agree with the data. Overall, the win rates between people who had just the unique and who had the unique and Boundless Force Throw were few and far between, and really the reason why is because Force Repulse already solves the only problem that the Tire Throw or Boundless Force Throw is going to address. Now, what I mean by that is the only time that this has ever been really relevant was when you get a JTR on an enemy raid team that gets an uber amount of evasion stats because she was allowed to get inspired at one point and gained a bunch of mastery. The issue is, most of the time, Force Repulse right here will actually kill Rey, or rather kill JTR, because this damage cannot be evaded. And in addition to that, she's going to get hit with a bunch of buffs, regardless of whether you are attacking her or another enemy, because you will get just put all of them at once, deal a ton of damage to her, and likely kill her. So overall, this increases the win rates quite a bit, about 7%, or I guess that's what we're using our criteria for quite a bit. You will notice in this, most of these Omicron abilities do not add much overall, and 7% is actually one of our leading winners for Starkiller. So overall, gets a nice boost on offense with that Omicron. You can see that the win rates really do not change at all when you throw in the tire throw as well. Defensively, the win rates, or rather the hold rates, not the win rates, the hold rates for the Starkiller team move up marginally again with those two Omicrons. Not a whole lot. I fear that a little bit the defense numbers might be being modified by the fact that people who typically have more Omicrons typically have the team at higher relics and therefore just going to start holding better because the team overall is stronger. Don't really have data to back that up, but that might be an explanation for why these are going up slightly, whereas we see the definitive increase here. Next up, let's go ahead and talk about Malicos. And Malicos is a little bit sad when it comes to his second and third Omicron. He is the only character to progressively do worse on offense when you apply his other Omicrons. And it kind of makes sense to me when we look at his character, and rather his kit as a whole. And this really isn't meant as a knock on Malicos' Omicrons. The problem here is everything that he was ever going to do in his kit is already happening without these two. If we read this whole text, basically what's happening is Doubt is going to apply to all 4 of your enemy's allies rather than just 2. The issue is, if Doubt is consistently being dispelled on multiple characters, it's eventually going to make its way around to the 4, and they're just going to get into this terrible fear cycle that'll just keep going. And you don't need it to happen 4 times immediately. You can just have it happen 2 times once, and then it'll chain off of itself. And basically what I'm getting at is it just doesn't make a difference. Not to mention in 3v3, which we did not take data from, this isn't even active at all because you can only ever have 2 enemies in 3v3. In addition to that, Deprived Senses just doesn't really do enough overall. It adds some nice bonuses in, but this is not changing the personality, the flavor, or the overall dynamic for what Malicos is wanting to do, at least from an offensive perspective. Now, there are some defense uses where this will come into play, and we will look at that just here in a second. And I believe it's because he's going to make sure that his ability block cannot be resisted. Debuffs inflicted by this ability can't be resisted. And that could possibly be harmful for some C's trying to counter Malicos out there that are not using Watt or a plethora of Sith to die and dispel him to get rid of the ability block. Because what you can do, it's a little bit hard, but you can ability block chain a C in some circumstances, and this really aids in that. But again, that's only when C is being used against Malicos when Malicos is on defense. So going again back to our chart here, we can see that Malicos really does not improve as a counter when used on offense, but you can see that his hold rate does go up slightly once you start applying these other 2 Omicrons. Again, there might be a little bit of bias just because the players who have 3 Omicrons also have higher relics, but at the same time, I kind of have a tendency to just trust the data. Now, next up, if what we were just looking at was very sad, this is pretty intense. Malicos as an offensive counter, and granted, he's going after some tough teams, so to say that he has a 65% win rate with 1 Omicron really isn't that bad. He's typically trying to challenge some really strong stuff out there. But if you look at these increases for when you apply his second and his third Omicron, his second is his other unique, by the way, and having all 3 Omicrons, this is going to be his special where he throws rocks. That's a huge gap to be breaching. That's what, 18.5%, which if you look at a grain scale of all the Omicrons and everything they're doing between one and the other, that is the largest gap that we see closed on this entire list. So very good on both those accounts. And I like how each jump or each Omicron has a nice jump. So really, while you probably should get the 2 uniques first and then get the special, they all have very similar value. Defensively, we will see similar increases, not as much, and I kind of get why. The rock throwing, when you apply the Omicron, it is going to specifically make sure that Malicos is going to get more damage progressively as the battle goes on. So it makes more sense that it would be slightly better from an offensive source, because this completely kills timeouts, whereas on if you are having this character on defense, damage increasing, I guess, really wouldn't increase timeouts. It would help you kill your enemies faster. But at any rate, doing this, and then the healing immunity as well, that could probably help you from getting stuck, especially on some bigger teams like Rey, of which Malicos is kind of the main counter for right now, at least at the high end, where there are a bunch of Datacrons doing gross things. So overall, Malicos has some of the highest changes when it comes to his second and third Datacrons. Next up is Bane, and I guess we can kind of take this with a grain of salt because he's only been active for one season, and not as many people have him as the top 3 characters that we've talked about. But at the same time, we do see a good 8% jump between his first Omicron and a second. Again, the first Omicron is going to be unique. The second Omicron is going to be the one that increases cooldowns. And then the third Omicron actually sees a decrease again in overall viability. I don't think that actually makes him worse, but I think that people were more tempted to try him against sketchier things and it ended up kind of blowing up in their face. And overall, it's probably just good to be in the sweet spot of only having the first 2. Defensive viability, I honestly, it's nice to have the data. I just don't think this is relevant to talk about at all because there's almost no scenario out there where someone should be leaving Bane on defense. Next up is going to be Reva. Another character that got kind of weird when it came to applying her other Omicron. I did mark this here as special because I don't know, Reva's second Omicron choice to me wasn't obvious. In fact, that's going to be true for Aphra and Bane as well. We went with the special because more people had it applied. That was pretty much her only criteria. These gains are just way too small. Like, so obviously this isn't even a gain, this is a loss. And then even after that, we see like a 2% gain, not even that, from here to here. I don't know. It just doesn't feel worth it at all. It seems like there is something going on as far as defensive viability goes for Reva. And that exact same theme is going to be repeated very similarly for both Aphra as well as Bo. The only difference is with Bo-Katan, it seems that her unique specifically to ignore taunt is pulling quite a bit of weight when it comes to defense, seeing a 5% change, whereas only saw a 2% change on offense. And then Bo's special seems to be not doing that much at all. I really have no opinion on this. I'm pulling this entirely from the data. I don't have Bo unlocked, and when I go against her, she typically just blows up whatever I send against her anyways. And again, very similar to Bane, we have to take everything with Bo, probably even to a larger degree, with a grain of salt, because she's being heavily carried by her Datacron. Not to say that she's bad, but overall, you might be able to take 0 Omicrons in right now and probably slaughter still a bunch of stuff. And yeah, so I'm not sure how much of this is going to be relevant, but again, kind of a sucker for data, so we went ahead and grabbed it anyways. And lastly, looking at Ben Silva, and now this one was surprising, and this is going to be the one that conflicts with my opinion the most. And I guess, you know, Data's probably more right than Calvin is. But the healing immunity, the second Omicron that you would apply to him, does increase his overall offensive ability by 4%, which again makes sense. It would make sense that it also wouldn't increase that much on defense because it's kind of at random and it's not really in your favor. You want it to be hitting a crucial character. Although it does increase the defensive hold viability by about 1%, or 5%, sorry. Overall, the ignore protection Omicron really doesn't seem to be doing anything at all. And sorry to say, I know several people who are big fans of this. This has been my experience as well. Every single time that I fought someone who had this third Omicron, it's never once made a difference. There was one time where it was really cool, where Ben came in and he one-shot my Hoda from underneath protection, and then my Jolie revived him, and we won. And that was the most impactful I've ever seen it do anything. I guess it might be able to do more on offense, but both from a data perspective and my opinion, it doesn't seem to be pulling much weight overall. So now that we've kind of talked about that, I realize that was a lot of data and it could have been kind of confusing. So what I've done is I've condensed every single difference between having 3 Omicrons and having 1 Omicrons, both for defense and offense, and then I've combined them. So overall, this is kind of where we end up from a conclusion standpoint. Starkiller has about 10% win or hold rate increases overall between the two. Most of that is going to be found in his AoE. The tire throw doesn't really seem to be changing much. I realize it had its use at one time, but overall the AoE seems to be solving not only that problem, but also a lot of others, especially when it comes to those Ray comps that have a lot of buffs because of either Cal or Swordy or whoever. Next up, Malicos is... if there is a loser on this list, it's definitely Malicos. Again, he saw drops in overall offensive viability, not probably again because the Omicrons made the character worse, but they're not making him better, and those people who have more investment are probably going after higher level things. Defensively, it seemed to change things just slightly. I think we were seeing 2% gains or so, but overall he's at that, which is not good. Malicos is the very clear winner, and it's not close. He has great gains on every single level. Not only are both the second and the third Omicron good investments, but they have some versatility between both offense and defense, coming out a little bit more ahead on the offense side, but still overall very good. Bane, the cooldown increase did seem to be making a difference, which that does make a lot of sense to me. Riva, Aphra, and Bo all kind of land in similar categories. Riva's appear that she's doing on better for defense. Aphra's makes sense. We didn't talk about hers a lot, but in 5v5, which is dumb that she has it isolated to 5v5, one of her Omicrons has this really weird clause where if a droid falls into like the 20% area, they'll get damage immunity. And I could see that screwing people about 10% of the time. Most of the time, they're just going to get one shot from 50% health or 100% or something like that and die. But I do see where that viability is coming through on defense. Bo unique looks good. It's really hard to say with the lack of data. And overall, Ben Solo, the healing immunity is probably okay. And we've talked about my opinion versus the data a little bit. Really, where I would differ here from what is actually being said is, to me, Ben Solo's second Omicron seems way more important than Starkiller's second. I feel like most of what Starkiller's doing is already happening from his unique, whereas Ben having the healing immunity, I would think, would isolate a few more counters out there. I know that I've had several opportunities where I've either been using SLKR or maybe once or twice using C, which that counter should just be entirely in the toilet, regardless of how many Omicrons you have. Or even JML, where he's landed healing immunity on Jolie. 4 turns is just way too long to have any type of detrimental debuff like that. But the data says this, so take your pick on what you like more, the data or Calvin's opinion, or maybe even your own. But thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this information was helpful, and as always, stay awesome.